Second speaker is probably known to everyone in the room, but I think it's important for me to say about Dr. Harry Burns that he's one of the reasons I came from Canada, and that is that I need to work in an environment where there's visionary leadership. And Harry's combination of having a deep grasp of human biology as a former surgeon for many years in Glasgow, and his insight into the social determinants of health is combined as well with, I think, a profound belief that the life course is the most productive lens through which to understand how humans' health and function is determined. And all of these have now, he's been amplifying this perspective by his recent focus on assets, which I'm sure he'll mention this morning, and thinking about what communities have that can help them move forward. So it's a great pleasure to have him with us this morning as a colleague and a friend. Harry.
Thanks, John. I won't be nearly so polite as Grant about smoking. It is a horrible habit. No apologies. Stop it at once. Okay. The title of this talk that was given to me, which I didn't choose, Overview of Current Scottish Government Policies Surrounding Adolescent Health and Behaviours Within the Context of an Asset-Based Model. I don't think so. I'm not going to talk to that title because I don't think it's possible to talk to that title. Current Scottish policies have not been pulled together within the context of an asset-based model. In fact, I don't think any policies have been deliberately drawn up or applied with that in mind. We've been talking a lot about it. I recently had a phone call from an international agency asking us to set up a training programme for other countries on asset-based public health. I said, "You're joking. We've talked a lot about it, but we don't do it." So what I'm suggesting is that the time has come to do things differently about policy development and implementation, and that is essentially what I'm going to try and describe. And I want to start off by putting Scotland's health in its proper context. There is a belief out there that Scotland is inherently an unhealthy country. It's not. This is life expectancy in a number of Western European countries over the past 150 years, with the blue line, oops, I should have tried this out first, with the blue line there is the Scottish life expectancy during that time. You can see a number of places. You can probably spot France and Germany there. They're these ones where you've had various wars and so on that have afflicted Western Europe very severely. But you can see that for about 100 of the last 150 years, Scottish life expectancy has been about average for Western Europe. It's only at the top end where there we go, where other Western European countries have begun to pull away from Scotland, really round about this period, 1950 to 1970. Places like Portugal, where in the middle of the 20th century they were way behind us in terms of life expectancy, have joined the rest of Europe and overtaken us. So something has emerged within the past 50 years that has slowed down the progress of life expectancy and health more generally in Scotland. And I would argue that it's the progressive widening of health inequalities. That top line is the trend in life expectancy in the most affluent 20% of men since the 1950s. Bottom line is the most economically deprived 20% of men. A persistent and steady and progressive widening in life expectancy. If we had improved, if we'd kept that gap as it is and improved life expectancy in the most deprived at the same rate as the most affluent, life expectancy would be up here 2 or 3 years higher, and we would be back where we were 100 years ago in the middle of the Western European pack. There's nothing endemic Nothing requires us to be unhealthy. Something has emerged in the past 50 or 60 years. And Alistair Leyland from the MRC unit in Glasgow a couple of years ago produced a very interesting analysis of this. He talked about the way in which we display health inequalities. We usually take, we lay out, say, the incidence. This is mortality per 100,000 people in different deprivation categories. And we usually subtract the best from the worst, and we say that is what the gap is. In fact, what he did was he created a thing called the slope index of inequality. The gap divided by the mean comes up with a number, and if the slope of the line is about 45 degrees, that number is 1. And he did this for 5-year age bands in Scotland, and he plotted the age range at which inequality is greatest in Scotland. You can see that it's not up here, it's not amongst older people that inequality is at its greatest. It's down here, it's in the 20 to 45 age group. It's working age people that sees inequality at its greatest. And at its greatest, the slope index of inequality is more than twice that 45-degree slope. So what you can then do is you can take different causes of death. Here's heart disease, that's the slope index of inequality, and subtract that from that, and it gives you something else. And you can do that for a whole range of causes of death, and it allows you to build up an inequalities map, if you like. That is where heart disease impacts in terms of creation of inequality. It isn't a big contributor to inequality, and it occurs at an older age group. And if you were to do it for all the leading causes of death, that's what it looks like. Down here, you've got these causes of death that are causing inequality in our society. Assault, disorders due to drugs, suicide, chronic liver disease, disorders due to alcohol, accidents. It's not the conventional problems. The conclusions that Alistair reached was that there was increasing mortality amongst younger men. These increases were due to suicide, chronic liver disease, drugs, alcohol use, and violence. And that was what was essentially driving that picture. We've got another study that confirms this, study done by the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. David Walsh and colleagues looked at income inequality in 3 UK cities: Liverpool, Glasgow, and Manchester. And what they found was that income inequality and income distribution was identical in these 3 cities. That's Glasgow, that's Liverpool, Manchester's the same. You can't tell the 3 cities apart. What they found was that the causes of premature mortality in these 3 cities varied greatly. They were the same in Liverpool and Manchester. The dotted line here is standardised mortality rate for Liverpool and Manchester, the same in both cities. Standardised mortality rate for these 7 causes of death was, as shown here, 60% of the excess premature mortality in this study was caused by drugs, alcohol, suicide, and violence, exactly the same as Alistair Leyland's analysis. And what we have seen over the past 50-odd years is the emergence of problems like alcohol and drug-related deaths coming from these cities, particularly West Central Scotland. So, the fundamental issue in Scotland is something that's happening to the younger population, not the older population. I want also to bring in the idea that it's happening to really young people as well, because if you look at what the risk factors are for things like drug abuse, alcoholism, violence, you find a lot of evidence that suggests that the seeds of that kind of behaviour are sown in very early life. Adverse childhood events study carried out in affluent Californians, members of the Kaiser Permanente health plan in California, 9 different kinds of abuse studied, different kinds of abuse, neglect, substance abuse by a parent, domestic violence, parental mental illness, parental criminality, absence of a parent. What they did was they looked at the impact of those 9 different adversities on subsequent behaviour. 4 or more of these adverse outcomes, of these adverse experiences, means that you're 7.5 times more likely to become an alcoholic in later life, as if you had none of these adverse experiences. Boys who experience physical abuse as a child are 8 times more likely to beat up their girlfriends when they're teenagers and almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for carrying a weapon. The kind of adverse behaviour seen in our communities can have its seeds in very early life. So it's a complex problem that we have to settle that involves parenting, it involves very early years, as well as that transition into working age life that adults have to go through. The seeds of the inequality that we see in working age life are sown much earlier. Teenage pregnancy, 5 or more adverse events leads to significantly increased risk of teenage pregnancy. It's all there in the literature. I would argue that the problem, as the great Jimmy Reed said 40 years ago, the problem is alienation in these communities. We showed some of this data to Bruce Armstrong, a professor of public health recently, a professor of public health from Australia. And his response was immediate. What he said was, I've seen this kind of emergent ill health before. You see it in the Aborigine population in Australia. The problem is the behaviours and health patterns that emerge in individuals and communities dislocated from traditional societal norms. What we've seen is psychosocial problems emerge in younger Scots over the past few decades that have led to this widening in inequalities. And alienation from traditional ways of living has been at the root of it. We've been to Liverpool and Manchester to talk to colleagues there, and they say, oh, you know, when we lost all those jobs in the 50s and 60s, they were replaced by other things. For most communities in West Central Scotland, they were never actually replaced. Now, the kind of policies that we've got, and I'll just refer to a couple. I mean, these are quotes from some of our current policies. A strategic approach. It's got all the buzzwords that you would expect from policymakers. Strategic approach, whole population approach at the heart of our framework. A package of over 40 measures, more must be better, to reduce alcohol-related harm, prevent problems arising in the first place, improve support and treatment for those expect. You know, that's all good stuff. That's all exactly what you would expect if you were writing a strategic plan for dealing with alcohol misuse. What about sexual health? Sexual health and blood-borne virus framework got a lot of very positive comments when it was written. 5 high-level outcomes: want to reduce STIs, fewer unintended pregnancies, reduction in the health inequalities gap. You know, good things. This is what it says. Early years recognised as important. Reduce poor sexual health outcomes. Good stuff. But read this paragraph. The approach is that of multi-agency working with strong local partnerships involving NHS, local authorities, third sector, multi-agency sexual health strategy groups, they must be fun, are encouraged to work closely with alcohol and drug partnerships. Can you imagine the Christmas party there? Interventions will be targeted at those most at risk. Nowhere does it talk about the people that you're trying to serve. It's all about multi-agency working, sexual health strategy groups, alcohol and drug partnerships, and you are targeting those like a bomber. Okay. This is the language of doing things to people, not with people. And it's doing things with people is at the heart of the thinking behind the asset-based approach. Scottish Government responded to the Christie proposals by talking about partnerships, participative, harnessing the full spectrum and of talents and capacities, not just of public bodies, but citizens, third sector organisations, local businesses, open, inclusive. It's a different kind of language. Greater responsibility and control in the hands of citizens and communities. But haven't we been doing that? The Ottawa Charter in 1985 said all of that. We've been doing community development for years. And again, that's the problem. Community development is something professionals do to communities. The assets-based approach would say the individuals in those communities are the people that do community development for themselves. John McKnight, the founder of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute in Illinois in the United States, says, the problem is we are obsessed with systems. What he talks about, what he describes as a system is this, quite simply, a hierarchy which is designed to allow a few people to control many people. And those are good. I mean, when I fly up from London, I don't want the plane to be flown by a committee. I want someone to be in charge, okay? But the main purpose of a system is allow production of a great deal of the same thing. Goods, in the case of McDonald's, great way of providing lots of hamburgers, or services in the case, say, of a social work department. But the critical thing about systems is they need to function on the basis of need in the community. McDonald's needs you to want a hamburger. A social work department needs people in difficulty. And we tend to define people in terms of their difficulties and their deficiencies. The problem is we have allowed communities in crisis to be surrounded by systems that do things to them. We have social work departments, we have housing officers, we have police, we have health visitors that go in with social workers to take children away as the perception. You know, we have a whole set of complex things where people sit in the middle, and round about them there are systems that do things to them. In the early part of the 19th century, a French political theorist called Alexis de Tocqueville went to the United States and wrote a book called Democracy in America. It was very new. It hadn't been seen in the world for 2,000 years since the fall of Athenian democracy. For 2,000 years, Europe had been ruled by monarchies, and in the last decade or two before de Tocqueville went travelling, it had been ruled by a meritocracy after the French Revolution. This thing, democracy, astounded him. With amazement, he said, what I found were associations of citizens. You know what? They decided what their problems were, they decided how to solve them, and they decided to organise to implement the solution. Isn't that amazing? It was a new thing. He wrote, I mean, he was a very interesting writer. I mean, one of the quotes that sticks in my mind was, democracy will survive until governments realise they can bribe the people with the people's own money. In those circumstances, the banks will collapse and dictatorship will return. Who knows? The answer is, we need a mix of all these things. We need systems. I want a hip replacement, if I ever need one, to be done not by an association of citizens. Thank you very much. But many of the problems that we see in those communities of alienated, dislocated people and families can be solved by coming together within associations and within communities. And I've spent the last couple of years looking very closely at what is it about asset-based interventions that work. Mainly the ones that work in the third sector, and they mainly work by connecting people. At heart, the single common feature of all the different interventions I've looked closely, from Alcoholics Anonymous to theatre groups that work with prisoners to housing charities and so on, At bottom, they connect people. And there is good epidemiological evidence that shows that social connectedness is a powerful health-promoting phenomenon. Meta-analysis showed that if you have a complex pattern of social integration, it doubles your chances of surviving in any of these, during the time of any of these studies. Even living with someone as opposed to living with no one confers a 20% survival benefit. That's significant. That's of the order of not smoking, of taking exercise and so on. Social connectedness is important, and what we're seeing is conditions that arguably are associated with alienation and disconnection. So how do I think that the Scottish Government should begin to shape its policies on this kind of thing in order to enhance this? What we see, what I have observed, what I've participated in is a process of community building that usually starts off with half a dozen people. I've been asked to go and visit projects that are falling over for lack of money or whatever, and you sit down and you talk to people, and round the table at some point someone says, well, what do we want to see in this community? What's our vision for the future? And it's almost as if they've been given permission to think the unthinkable. And the conversation begins to roll round at a point where I make my excuses and leave. They've started, the fire has been lit. And a few weeks later, you'll go back and you'll find that the 6 people in the room have become 60. They've recruited folk, they've started this process of community building, and suddenly folk are coming out the woodwork. A business that folk were hardly conscious of, because many of these communities don't function on the basis of employment, will suddenly appear and make a donation of goods or services or whatever that allow children to start a youth club or whatever. And suddenly the assets of the people and the community at large are beginning to be used for the benefit of all. I've seen it happen time and time again. The question is, what should local authorities, the health service, the third sector, Scottish Government do? A bit of it is keep out the way. As the community begins to grow, it will grow, however, to a point like a plant that becomes pot-bound. It just can't grow anymore because it begins to bump up against the sides of things like planning law and revenue and so on. What we need to do is get into a relationship that co-produces growth within the community, connectedness between people, people coming together in associations to identify and solve their own problems. And when they find a problem that they can't solve themselves, that's when these bodies should become involved, not to solve it for them, but to solve it with them. Co-production. I like the definition of co-production of the New Economics Foundation. It points to the fact that conventional delivery models carry the seeds of their own demise. They disempower people. They fail to recognise people's own strengths and assets, engender a culture of dependency that stimulates demand. Co-production has the potential to transform public services, and I think that's absolutely right. This idea that the outcome here is connectedness. In future, every policy, every intervention that we do, I mean, at the moment, when you write a policy paper, you have to check that it's been agreed with the finance director. Well, we need to check if it's been approved by the connectedness director in future as well. Does it help people connect and grow? Because if it doesn't, take it away and think again. Another definition of co-production. It's about citizens and the public sector making better use of each other's assets and resources. So I think that what we need to do is to allow people to connect, support them in developing a vision for the future, work with people in developing their capacities and their sense of control over their lives, and that means doing things differently. I just want to show you a couple of examples of where this sort of approach has been carried out in a very, very deprived part, one of the most deprived parliamentary constituencies in Britain. And what we did was we asked people what their perceptions were of real life in that area. And they did it, it was a whole community thing. It wasn't just young people, it was older people as well. The whole community got together and they had a sort of jigsaw approach. Folk wrote things on pieces of jigsaws and they tried to put them together. But what they came up with was this: real life in their neighbourhoods had a whole range of things round about it. And they then took each of these blocks and drilled into them and said, well, what does this actually mean for us? And I'll just show you a couple of examples. Real life in their neighbourhood in terms of education. All of the things round about it were related to the fact that automatically they assumed they were going to do badly. Young people in that neighbourhood believed learning's not cool, they're expected to underachieve, there are ready-made assumptions that they will do badly, negative perceptions, oh, and by the way, we don't teach them to be healthy. Incredibly negative. They did the same for self-esteem. It was basically, well, did you have the latest trainers? Did you have a plasma TV? Did you have a PlayStation? Did you have a cool phone? A lot of their self-esteem, they assumed, was based around material things. And they said pursuing self-esteem led to competition to appear better off, increasing debt and poverty. If we had gone into that room with our perceptions, our middle-class assumptions, would we have come up with that? I don't think so. So the whole co-production exercise is fundamentally based on listening to what people are telling you and trying to help them solve those issues themselves, not imposing our values on them. Nearly finished. What I think happens in any society is a cycle that looks like this. We get things like common knowledge, the things that we all assume we know about our society and the way it works and so on. And what I've just shown you is in one deprived community in Scotland, common knowledge is about things that are very different from what I assume about our society. We recognise there's materialism, but most folk would see a kind of spiritual almost dimension to society as well in terms of art and culture, etc. None of that mentioned in the work that we had done in that community. So how do you generate a learning and an improving culture? And what we've got here is a diagram produced by a recently deceased sociologist called Max Boisseau. Max's last job was trying to understand the sociology of the Large Hadron Collider. Okay, 35,000 physicists all living underground, not a chief executive in sight, doing most complex things, but it worked. How did it work? And basically the example that he used, that I saw him use, was common knowledge starts off with the knowledge that if you let go of something, it falls to the ground. Everyone knows that. Our communities have been built on that for eons. And then one day someone has an insight. Newton observes apples, scans, sees apples, develops his 3 laws of motion, force equals mass times acceleration, and gradually there's a codification takes place of that. You know, that turns into an understanding of cars, internal combustion engine, motion, aeroplanes, how you send a rocket to the moon. And gradually, the end result of Newton's laws of motion is the Large Hadron Collider. But what Boisseau says is the more you codify, the more you specialise knowledge, the less likely you are to get it back down there. Yeah, people can understand cars now, spend time getting that cycle going there. How will anyone ever begin to understand the implications for the daily lives of the Large Hadron Collider, you know? Point is, the more we codify, the more we narrow knowledge, the more complex way we describe knowledge, the harder it is to get it out there in communities and to change the way communities work. What do we do in policy development? We make it complicated. We design things with complicated language. We talk about partnerships with multi-agencies and so on without any thought as to complex adaptive systems thinking. Go out there and do partnership. It's hard to get things back in the more complicated you do it. And I mean, what's in here, the red dots here, are the processes that you undergo in moving from one box to the other. And the blue things are the structures that we need in order to move things. We need a community of practice, a community that goes across government, local authority, third sector and so on, that understands what we're trying to do here, which I would argue is connect people and support them in moving forward at their own pace in terms of their own perceived needs. At some point, they will need some kind of specialised knowledge, for example, early years. Well, there's a lot of things out there like Family Nurse Partnership, Triple P, lots of things that we can do to measure progress and so on. At some point, we will need a team of people who can sit and make that specialised knowledge available to fuel that approach. Max used to point out that decide has the same etymological root as homicide. In deciding, we kill off options. We take lots of insights down here and decide, okay, there's only 5 of them that are relevant. So that's a very critical step. We need to be really careful that when we move into that sphere, we don't make it too complicated, and we do that through listening to this community. Diffusing, we've got lots of ways of communicating, better ways of communicating specialised knowledge now than we ever had. But the way in which we get that specialised knowledge back into the way communities work is through networks. Networks of people all involved, all engaged in this whole process. So there's different patterns of behaviour that we need, but the critical thing is listen here and be careful how you decide here. Just finally, if we're really going to get to the key point in all of this, we need to do things really differently. And all of these things are points that colleagues in St Andrews House have made to me about this. Things like relationship building, shared power, giving up power, allowing solutions to emerge rather than specialising. When we started talking about outcomes, I was besieged in the office by people who wanted to develop an outcomes framework for the assets approach or a governance system. Please. You need to stand back and let solutions emerge. Be it creativity, dispersed leadership, resources, yeah, they all need to shift. And new skills, reflective practice, cycles of improvement and so on, cycles in which we look, well, has this worked? No, well, we need to try something else. So I think there's a huge challenge. I think there's a huge opportunity. If we're really going to apply the assets approach, I think the key thing that binds it all together is connection between people, allowing people to grow communities, and co-production. Not doing things to people, but doing things with people and communities as a way of allowing solutions to grow. That, I think, is the way that young people will be integrated back, feeling they have a place, a stake in their future, that the answer is not oblivion through drink and drugs. The answer is not fighting every Friday night. The answer is looking forward to a future in which they play a part and which they have the opportunity to contribute to the growth of Scotland in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Harry. Well, you see why Harry's Chief Medical Officer of Health, can't you? Visionary indeed. Thank you. We're on time, so we have a good quarter hour for questions and comments from the floor, which I'm happy to field to either of our first 2 speakers. Just put your hand up, and I would ask you to say who you are and just briefly where you work or live, whichever you prefer. Yes. You have to speak. Yes, there is a microphone. It's just coming. So do speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Graham Mackenzie, consultant in public health and NHS Lothian. And the question is, well, it's an observation for Harry Burns. You talked, Harry, about the kind of disconnect between policy making and community work. And I think we have an example of work that we've done in Lothian where we broke the rules. I'll be honest here. We had some money around child healthy weight 3 years ago, and we didn't like the idea, and we took it to the community in North Edinburgh, and they told us what they wanted to do, and so we followed what they wanted to do, and it was through the staff in the council that we did it with. So it wasn't solely the community. It was with community learning and development people who kind of opened up the community to us, and the people had fantastic ideas, and we ran with what they did, with what they suggested, and they really led the work along with CLD. And these are people that they trusted because they had worked with them in the schools or the community, or even with grandparents. So what we did is we did some community learning, and we then the outcomes have been fantastic. People have talked about becoming healthier. They were very receptive. They didn't have the negativity that you mentioned, but possibly that's because we've talked to people at the end of the programme who have been the real kind of leaders for this. And they also talked about jobs that they've managed to get because of the work that they've done. And they also talked about open university courses and things that they've managed to do through further education. So I don't think we need to be worried too much. I think it's just a bit of imagination.
Yeah. There's lots of examples of that kind of thing happening all over the place. I mean, another example of rule breaking is in Dumfries and Galloway, where the Equally Well money has been used not to measure risk factors in for heart disease in middle-aged men, but actually to connect communities. And so I don't for a second think that I'm suggesting that there aren't good things happening out there. What we've got to do, though, is to do them at scale, to get it all connected up, to do it across the whole of Scotland in a consistent way, to learn from each other about what has worked. The number of times I've heard in visiting local authorities or health boards, people say, oh yes, we heard about that project, but that happened over there. We couldn't possibly do it here. The not invented here syndrome, or one of the great ones was a planning project in a local authority where the two planners told me that the day they left the office to start this project, their boss had them in and said, whatever you do, don't raise any expectations out there. You know, we really need to change our way of thinking in all of this and have a common theme. And there will still be room for creativity and individuals doing all sorts of different things, but share the ideas. It really frustrates me that what has tended to happen in the past is we've given money for a 3-year project that has maybe been incredibly successful. At the end of the 3 years, the money goes away and the project stops. This needs to be embedded. We need to do it all the time. It needs to be the way in which we do things.
That piece of work, it cost £2,500 and it reached 60 families, which it cost nothing.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. I mean, we've got an example of a health system in the States where they really realised they needed to do some community development. And what they did was they set up a committee, and 6 months later, nothing had happened. So the chief executive said, right, end the committee. From now on, every nurse in our healthcare system can take half a day a week off to go out and do some community work. Not asking what it is. The only rules are don't do anything illegal, and if you spend any money, I want a receipt. And of course, the whole thing just mushroomed. And it's that kind of space and creativity and standing back. I mean, what I would like, actually, is every civil servant, every member of a local authority, every local authority officer to have half a day a week to go and work with somebody of their choice, because they won't come back and may come up with solutions that are so patently off the wall in terms of the community's perception of things. You need to be connected. And you need to be connected to the people you're trying to work with. But somehow I don't think that will happen.
Okay, another question or comment from the floor? Yes, go ahead.
Should I just shout out?
No, because we're taping this for putting on the web.
Okay, sorry. My name's Sonia Scott. I'm a public health registrar in Glasgow. And I have a question for Grant and Harry, if that's okay. My question to Grant would be, how would I find out more about the Scottish Youth Parliament? For example, who in my area is the representative? Is there a website I could go to? Or?
Well, the Scottish Youth Parliament obviously has its own website. Just type Scottish Youth Parliament into Google and you'll get us. And then we developed a whole new website to make it much easier. So if you go on to Who Are We, you'll get every single constituency within the Scottish Youth Parliament, and you can just click on that. Basically, the way the Scottish Youth Parliament works is 156 members are elected, so there's 2 representatives for every constituency which is in the Scottish Parliament. So for every MSP you have, you get 2 MSYPs.
Great, thank you. And my question for Harry would be, I think it sounds fantastic and I've really bought into the idea, and it seems to me the key thing would be a cultural shift in terms of professional thinking and hierarchies, and we live in such a hierarchical culture politically.
Especially in Glasgow. I can say that because I've been there for a long time.
Yeah, but just in all sorts of ways, and sometimes I think, as well as thinking about the grassroots, what do we change structurally that can influence the culture?
I don't think the solutions are structural. I mean, what complex adaptive systems change as a result of 3 influences. The first thing is you destabilise them, okay? And by destabilisation, I don't mean necessarily something horrible. You just say, okay, as of today, we're doing something different. And you force the people in it to say, right, the old way is gone. I mean, I can give you an example. I worked with 2 guys in a business school some years ago writing some stuff about this. And they had destabilised a family business that the owners had been trying to change the workforce, get workforce to do things differently for ages, and they wouldn't do it. So it was a business, I think it was a small manufacturing business. What they did was they hired a big van, and on Sunday they took the van in, went to the workshop and took away all the machinery. So that the workforce came in on Monday to an empty factory. That was destabilisation. And then they brought in the new machinery and said, okay, you decide where the machinery goes to make it more efficient. So you destabilise things, you have a simple order generating rule, like when we introduced cancer networks, the simple order generating rule was, whatever you do, organise it to make cancer care better. And the third thing is, you need to be prepared for solutions to emerge that you didn't anticipate. You can't control the outcome. So in this case, what I've tried to do with the assets approach is boil it down to its simplest order generating rule. Does this allow people in communities in crisis to connect? Does it allow people in communities to connect and become more cohesive and help and support each other? Because that's what people do. So the simple order generating rule that should be in everyone's mind is, what am I doing supporting connectedness? You don't need structural change, because folk will revert to their original behaviour if you change structures. They'll just behave the same way in a different structure. Simple rules.
Yeah, I mean, just if I'm allowed one kind of comeback comment, it would be more about the political centralisation, the centralisation of political power, and whether we need to, as a group of sort of advocates, be advocating for that to be devolved and devolved and devolved. Because I think that does mitigate against people. Because if I think of people in the East End of Glasgow, there is a connectedness there amongst the most deprived groups, but they feel disempowered.
There's nothing in our structures that stop this happening, because I can see local authorities, I can see health boards right across Scotland that are doing this, that are up for this, that have changing and are changing. Equally, I can see some that, hell will freeze over before they change. The answer is, they will move with the tide. If we get the momentum going in the right direction, people will see the impact of it.
Just stay for a minute and we'll take another one. Yes, ma'am.
I went to that. Sorry, I've never needed a microphone in my life, I have to tell you. I went to the bathroom, so I may have missed this. I thought it was very interesting. I come from a very deprived area of the northeast. I grew up on one of the worst estates there, so I come from that background, and now I'm an academic. My concern is when we deal with things in this situation is where does the evidence base sit? If I went into the Meadow Well, into my sister's house, and talked to her about, and all her friends and all of my friends from school, about what we should be doing in a certain situation, I know for a fact that they think there's nothing wrong in the main with smoking during pregnancy, with having children very early on. As long as they're drinking and not using drugs, I don't have a problem with this. So where does the evidence base fit into this?
I don't know if you can put the yeah. That's where the evidence base fits in.
But in reality...
In reality, that's where the evidence base fits in. That's what you do. You try to take the insights. And, you know, the northeast of England, for example, is a fantastic... Stephen Singleton is a fantastic public health evidence-driven medical director. He has changed smoking during pregnancy radically by applying evidence-based interventions. So the trick is to the way in which the team of experts, because you do need experts, takes the kind of insights that have been generated with the community and sits with the community to pare down all the different options. That's where the evidence base comes in. But having said that, at the end of the day, the best evidence for this kind of approach are the stories of thousands of people across Scotland who have changed their lives as a result of this kind of approach. It's in the realm of anecdote, but I mean, John and I were talking earlier on about some of the ways in which we could show that change will take place. For example, if we have an approach to early years that says, let's apply, of all the things that we can do to support women during pregnancy, to support babies in early life and so on, let's get 5 or 6 things that fit with what the community wants and sees as its need and so on, but which we see are necessary as well. Let's get an agreement on those 5 or 6 things, and let's work out a measurement structure that looks at things like infant mortality, child protection registrations, readiness to learn at aged 5, developmental delay at the 24-month health visitor assessment and so on. Birth weight for gestational age takes care of smoking and diet during pregnancy. There's lots of things that we can measure readily that will allow us to know, are things going in the right direction? So I'm not worried about the evidence base. I think we can tell from anecdote that connected people are much healthier and much better off than alienated people. Our problem is alienation of the younger section in society. Let's just get on and reconnect them, and the academics will have a field day measuring all sorts of different things. Lots of money going out from the chief scientist.
See a hand back there. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi there, my name's Colin McFarlane. I run a YMCA in North Lanarkshire. We run a number of very successful health projects for young people, with young people, one being a sexual health clinic. So obviously our focus is on young people, from the sort of 11 to 18-year-old. And it was interesting what you're saying around changing culture. And for me, that's one of the biggest issues we're going to face. Young people in today's society are continually stigmatised, they're continually cut off. And it's really a question to see, in regards to the development of policy, will there be thought given to how the media will then portray how young people are looked at, how they are pilloried within the community, and also looking at, well, how do we promote young people within our society to reconnect them?
I guess I'll take a little bit of the part on that. When you talk about, I actually know the YMCA you're talking about. I've been up to it since I'm from South Lanarkshire and North Lanarkshire work quite close together. when you're talking about the media stigmatism of young people and whether policy relates to that, I think you've seen in the last couple of years a strong focus from the Scottish Government and Westminster as well on trying to look at ways in which they can remove that stigmatism, which they can make young people seem as what we actually are. We're not the devils that were portrayed in the media. The problem is they've not done anything with it. They keep saying they're going to do stuff, and they keep, as you know, set up committees and have chief executives, and let's have this guy rule this, and let's do this quango and do that. They've not actually done anything about it, so there's a lot of talk going on right now. Hopefully something will come out from that. But what I would say is it actually goes down to this structure that you were talking about connectiveness. In a society, and everybody has it in your wherever you live, be it from East Kilbride myself, be it from Glasgow, be it from North Lanarkshire, you know the young people in your area, and you know the young people that are the Yobs and are the Neds and are going to cause trouble, and you get that everywhere. You get adults that are antisocial and all that. So it's not something you're ever going to eradicate from society, but it's about spreading that common knowledge of, you know, there's not really much need to be like that. You don't really need to do it. We don't need all this policy stuff to come out. We don't need all this evidence-based stuff of an ASBO did this and a jail sentence did that. You just the common sense of what do you want to do? Do you want to go and drink down a cold, damp well at some point, or do you rather go in and be a geek and play Dungeons and Dragons or something like that? I'm a geek, so I would rather do that. But I think the common knowledge of just spreading the different opportunities, different ideas that young people can do will give them a much healthier life and a much healthier background rather than, you know, the negative media portrayal that we get.
You want to follow up?
I wouldn't hold my breath.
That was my thought.
A big chapter in my memoirs is going to be about the media. You know, and you know, there are some really good journalists interested, want to find the truth, and there's a number and I guess it's mainly the editorial people that say no, we won't have that good news story when we can demonise those people over there. It's all about, you know, newspapers are disappearing, and it's all about sensationalism to keep selling them. So
yeah, I totally agree. Just to maybe come back with Grant. I'm not all, in our YMCA, we're not about discouraging young people who maybe want to go for a drink on the street. That might be what they choose to do. It's about educating and informing them that there are other options. And if something does go wrong, not stopping young people taking risks, because that's a rite of passage to be a teenager. It's about giving them the proper advice, support, and options to then make informed choices.
I was going to say, I definitely agree with that, just what you said there. It is a rite of passage, and every young person's going to make a few mistakes. Every young person's going to, you know, act like egg a house, or every young person's going to get really, really drunk and go home crying to their mum and, can I sleep in your bed tonight? That's what young people do. We've all done it. There's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with that. It's just about making sure that media portrayal isn't there, and making sure young people know the options and know what happens to them if they drink this much and what happens to them when they do that. Having that information out there, which I think is out there if you look for it.
You make an interesting point, because you've obviously got very successful activities going. One of the things I don't talk about when I talk about social connectedness, I deliberately don't talk about social cohesion, because social cohesion has negative connotations. Social cohesion within a gang is a bad thing. And it's the bridging social cohesion that allows young people exposure to adults who can act as mentors, who can show them a different set of options for their lives, who can help them produce a CV, who could help them, you know, point them in the right direction about employment. But, you know, it's that kind of social cohesion that I think we're talking about in advocating social connectedness. So, you know, great projects, the extent to which they link up with other projects and bridge and allow young people to cross those bridges, I think is a measure of success of the whole movement.
I am going to have to bring this to a close, but I want to have everyone put their hands together to thank our two speakers.